Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out Devex.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development. Well, hello everyone. We've got a special episode of This Week in Global Development for you. I'm actually here in Marrakech in Morocco, where the World Bank and the IMF annual meetings are taking place here in the pretty hot desert environment, and we've escaped the bustling conference center to hide away in a quiet conference room with a couple of experts to talk about an issue that I think is really important at this year's annual meetings. Before we get into that, I just want to mention that this week's podcast episode is sponsored by the Open Society Foundations, one of the largest private human rights funders. I think we all are familiar with OSF, and it gives grants to groups and individuals across 100 countries working to promote democratic principles, human rights, and justice. So we're here on the sidelines of this big event. In fact, we've got an event just coming up later today with Open Society Foundations on this very topic, the kind of politics of economic reform in the MENA region. And we're going to dive a little deeper into it today with two experts who are sitting next to me here across this big conference table. I've got Niranjan Sarangi with me. He's the Senior Economics Affairs Officer in the Shared Economic Prosperity Cluster at UN ESCWA. That's a long UN acronym we'll hear a little bit more about later on, Niranjan. And Sarah Saadoun, who is a senior researcher working on poverty and inequality at Human Rights Watch. Great to be with you, Sarah and Niranjan.
Thank you. It's my pleasure too.
Yeah, and Sarah, nice to be with you as well.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so the fact that we're in Morocco is probably pretty relevant to what we're talking about today. We went through a period with Russia's invasion of Ukraine where we saw food prices spike all over the world. That matters everywhere. But usually people focus a lot on this region when it happens because there's just such a direct impact on people's ability to buy bread. The prices, you can see them immediately spike in these economies. And there, of course, is a huge debt problem that's happening here in this region. And so when the interest rates have gone up, in the West, in the US, and elsewhere, and that's driven up global interest rates. Again, all eyes start to look at this region because you think, what's it going to mean here, where things could potentially crack or break first? And not just crack and break for governments, but for people, for ordinary people. And so we want to talk a little bit about what that means for them. Like here in Morocco, there is a 69% debt to GDP ratio. That's big, but it's even higher in its neighbors. In Tunisia, it's 79%. In Egypt, I guess it's 88%. So there's some significant challenges around debt. And when you think about debt and the macroeconomy, you think about the IMF. We're here for these meetings. And what is the IMF thinking about? What are they doing? What are they talking about on these issues? What is the sort of practical way forward? So the two of you think a lot about this stuff every day. And I'd love to get your kind of high-level take on where we are right now. Maybe, Sarah, we can just start with you. Why is it relevant to have a conversation about public debt, about social protection at these IMF and World Bank annual meetings, particularly for the MENA region?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think when we think about debt, it's important to go behind the numbers and behind debt to GDP ratio and look at and the risk of debt default and look at the impact on government spending and on people. Because right now, and even before the pandemic and the latest series of events, the amount that governments are spending on servicing debt, on debt interest payments, in many countries is higher than their spending on health and education, which has not only impact on people and on their rights, but also on the economy going forward. And the problem is that the way in which the IMF has been thinking about this is to actually cut government spending further in ways that makes it even harder for people to afford food, healthcare, education. And so when we're thinking about this problem, it's important to center the impact that it has on people. And I know we'll get into this a bit later, but I think that the issue is that the IMF is continuing to pursue these policies that hurt people, with the important difference that they are recognizing that that recognizing that the situation is inflicting huge pain on people, and that they're coalescing around this idea of improving social protection as the main buffer to protect people. But the problem is that the way in which they are approaching social protection, when we unpack that, is extremely, extremely narrow. And so they're satisfying themselves with the idea that they are protecting people from the impacts of not only the underlying crisis, but the ways in which they are exacerbating the crisis by saying, no problem, we have social spending floors, we're improving social protection, but when you unpack that, you realize that these are absolutely failing people because of how narrow they are.
Well, Niranjan, I want to get you in the discussion too. I mean, it seems to me like it's a simple math problem, isn't it? You know, the cost for interest payments on debt is going up, interest rates are rising, governments have to find that money somewhere. The IMF doesn't want to lend them money unless they know they can pay it back, so they say, hey, find places to cut. Isn't this a simple problem and just an unfortunate circumstance, or is there really some other way the IMF should look at this and some other way to get out of it?
No, that's definitely what you mentioned about the high interest rate is the cause right now. That's the recent cause. But also there is a historical context to it. That's not the only cause. The question is whether it is the only cause that is affecting the countries in the MENA region to address the debt situation. Of course, they have been facing high inflationary pressures. And cutting inflation is important because a lot of people in the region, their consumption is about more than 90% of their incomes, the working class and the lower middle class.
Right, so when prices go up, I mean, even a little bit, they're
10%
strained.
rise in prices will lead to impact their savings and their consumption, which affects their poverty situation. Plus also, I mean, if we are thinking of cutting interest rate, cutting inflation through interest rates, that also increases domestic borrowing costs. The region is also facing a growth crisis, or what we call it, over the last decade, it's about on an average 3%. If that is so, and the cost of borrowing is high, so the growth and rate of interest, growth rate versus the rate of interest of the borrowing is widening, and that means they are earning less but borrowing at a higher rate. So it's a simple math to see that if you are not earning as much as you can repay back, obviously the debt hangover goes up. So that's one of the historical context as well.
So in a way, even if we weren't in this high interest rate environment that's leading to this acute, immediate pressure, this long-term crisis has been going on for a while and would have continued to go on just because the growth is too low. And it's a huge political economy problem, both domestically and globally, right? Because domestically, you've got to weigh increasing taxes and the politics around that with cutting spending on social programs and the politics around that. And then globally, these countries have to negotiate with the IMF and with the international system. So Sarah, you were saying that it feels like the IMF has found what they think is a solution, they're presenting as a solution, but it's not really. Why is that the case? Why is the way they're defining social protection too narrow? How are they actually looking at it?
First, before I answer that, I want to just pick up on a point you mentioned about the fact that in MENA countries in particular, the tax system is not progressive at all, right? There are very, very low income taxes and very low corporate taxes and very high tax evasion. And so we're coming into a situation where governments are not raising revenues progressively. And that means that they're shifting the burden of recoveries onto people through both cutting spending, but also increasing regressive taxes like value-added taxes. And then, again, bringing in this issue of social protection. And in MENA countries, particularly since the Arab Spring, ironically, which was triggered itself by economic frustrations, there has been a shift away from the one measure that many MENA governments had relied on, which is subsidies. Now, subsidies are not great, particularly fossil fuel subsidies, which are contributing to climate change and delaying the energy transition. But they did play a very important role in the social contract in MENA countries. So the idea was, okay, we take away subsidies and we replace it with social protection, as we're seeing in Jordan and Egypt and other countries. But what do they mean when they say social protection? So social protection is a buffer, right? It's a way that people, it can be cash transfers, but it can be other forms of support for people throughout their life course, children, older people when you lose your job, you get sick, etc. it's also a human right. There's a human right to social security. The way in which the IMF and many governments have approaching this is we give it to people who, quote unquote, need it the most, which sounds very intuitive, right? If somebody is living in extreme poverty, they need it the most, we have limited funds, we'll give it to them. But what we know is that these types of programs fail people for many, many, many different reasons. They fail people because they don't actually reach the people they're intended to. There are extremely high error rates, but they also leave out a huge part of the population who are struggling. In Jordan, around a quarter of the population lives under the poverty line right now, which is itself set very low, which itself does not include the large refugee population. And yet the cash transfer program, which was part of an IMF program funded by the World Bank, only reaches around 1 in 5 families living under the poverty line.
Is that a problem of delivery? In other words, just poor bureaucratic operations, or is it more of like a political economy problem where people are saying, we're explicitly leaving out large groups of marginalized people?
It's all of the above. So we have a report that was published by Human Rights Watch by my colleague Amos Toe that looked at the algorithm that Jordan is using and showed how it relies on information that is discriminatory, inaccurate, etc. We spoke to many, many Jordanians who described applying to these programs and being excluded for them for what appears to be very random reasons, like they might own a car, but the car is actually registered under somebody else's, it's actually being used by somebody else or is inoperable, and they are therefore suddenly excluded from this program. But it also leaves out people by design, right? Because they are not considered, quote unquote, poor enough, even though they might be not have enough money to make sure their kids eat 3 nutritious meals a day. So it's an all of the above problem. I do want to point out that there have been governments in MENA that have been experimenting with a universal approach to social protection, which is consistent with human rights, which essentially says that anybody that's facing in a particular life situation, so children, older people, pensions, right, things like this, everybody qualifies for this. So we remove the risk of error rates. And yes, that means that some people who might not need the money because they're wealthier get these protections, but then we take it back through taxes, and that's the type of system that would really protect people. But that requires universal social security systems, complemented by a progressive tax system.
I can imagine, Niranjan, the economists listening to this and maybe hearing Sarah and saying, no, but this is progress. Like what she's describing as a challenge, they might say is the right direction. Like I'm remembering, as you well know, Niranjan, being a kid in India and my family standing in line at these ration stores, right, where you have a paper card and you can go in there and get subsidized food. And my family was middle class. I don't think they needed the subsidized food, but they and everybody else in their middle class neighborhood stood in line once a week and got it. It really shouldn't have been for them, but it was pretty standard. And so it sounds like, going away from a subsidy-focused approach like that, which can easily be cheated, is a way for the government to save money and therefore focus more resources on the people who really need it most. But Sarah's saying, well, that's not really happening. It's turned into maybe a cost savings measure for the government, but they're actually leaving huge numbers of people behind. Is that how you see it too?
It's. I would say that yes, this is part of the problem definitely. When we are looking at, at ESCOA we have an initiative on social expenditure monitor. We are trying to map how the budgets are channeled to different social policy areas and also who are the beneficiaries, and that's where I will connect to you how resources are allocated. Does the government know how the resources are flowing to certain sectors or certain people who are in need? And that's where I think the frameworks need to be improved, the tools need to be improved, how to channel resources properly and identify the challenge, where is the challenge, and they can improve targeting. We definitely see that the governments are doing some actions. For example, Jordan is one of the countries which has done significant reforms also in income taxes. However, the result is not there. The issue that Jordan is facing now is while they are not able to mobilize enough tax revenues despite significant reforms, they are also facing significant challenge on refinancing. Cost of borrowing is high. So the reforms that they have taken and the revenues that they generated is getting wiped out with the high interest cost of refinancing those. And Jordan being more than 90% of the debt to GDP country, the debt financing is significant, the debt servicing is significant and it constitutes more than 20% of its revenues. That means the resources that could have been channeled to more social spending, more health, education, or even those areas which build climate resilience, environment protection, but also generating jobs is one of the things that government needs to look at it more proactively, because the region is having a high unemployment rate for the youth. And improving creativity through investing in sports, arts, culture. These are social policies which are not talked about generally. When you look at it, those spendings on environment protection, on gender equality, investing in gender equality, advancing gender equality, building climate resilience, the total spending is less than 2% of GDP. So yes, there is a rebalance required in resource flow. They need to improve efficiency, that's key. Plus, they need to improve efficiency also in mobilizing resources, including in VAT. VAT is definitely regressive, but it's one of the major resource generating for most countries in the region, including the US. But it's much more efficient than what we see in the MENA countries. So the key is enlarge the pot of revenues through improving efficiency, and also optimize your expenditures through improving efficiency. That's one of the key. If you allow me, I will say that there is a greater role for the international community.
I want to get to that, but I just first want to imagine an IMF representative sitting with us, because you're using the word investment a lot here, and we're thinking about where we should spend more money. And I think their mindset is the opposite. It's, hey, this is a moment for austerity. Look, these are governments that have these very unstable debt to GDP ratios. We need to cut. Forget about investment. And yes, someone like Kristalina Georgieva knows very well how important these development and social protection issues are. I don't think the IMF is considering how do we just abandon the populations of these countries, but at the same time, we've got to shrink. We've got to shrink the public spending. Sarah, are we thinking about this in a way that's just unrealistic? Because I can imagine the IMF perspective being, this is just not realistic. We have to focus on austerity right now.
I think what's unrealistic is continuing to pursue the same policies that have failed and believing that this time they will succeed. Because the IMF this is the fourth program in the last decade that they have in Jordan, for example, and debt to GDP ratio is higher than when they started. And this is not uncommon. This is something that the IMF itself has acknowledged, that fiscal consolidations do not, on average, tend to decrease debt to GDP ratios. And so I think it's unrealistic to think...
And why is that, Sarah? Just explain. What's the theory behind why a fiscal consolidation, kind of cutting spending, wouldn't actually improve? It should improve debt to GDP, you'd think.
Look, I'm not an economist, but I can tell you what I heard on speaking to people in Amman when we were doing the research for this report. And we were speaking to shopkeepers who were describing people simply having less money to spend and therefore spending less money, and then people who are even considered quote unquote middle class, which is in a context like Jordan not the same as something like in the United States, having less money for them to spend on the kids' education, and then teachers having less money to spend. And so we see this domino effect that essentially takes money out of the economy and does not allow it not only to grow, because I don't want to focus on growth, but it's around the redistribution of resources, the distribution of resources in a society. And that's why I want to propose a different way of looking at social protection. It's not something that's meant to keep people from extreme poverty or even poverty. It actually goes to the distribution of resources in a society. It's not a poverty lens we should be looking through, but an inequality lens. And it plays such an important role in that. So what we're trying to do, what governments do through universal social protection systems, is it creates a social contract that all people see the benefit of their tax dollars. It creates a sense of social solidarity that actually drives people to be willing to pay these taxes, rather than somebody sitting there who is having trouble feeding their children saying, I didn't get this money because I have some car that doesn't even work, whereas my neighbor did, which only fosters mistrust, lack of political buy-in for these programs, which is exactly what we heard from people when we interviewed them in Jordan. I want to make one other point, which is that, again, this is happening while governments are removing or have removed subsidy on electricity and fuel, which generates enormous savings. But where are those savings going? In Jordan, what we saw is that between 2012, when fuel subsidies were removed, and 2017, the amount of spending on social protection actually decreased. The amount of spending on health, education, and social protection as a percentage of GDP remained flat. And so we have these huge savings, but rather than investing them in ways that actually advance people's economic and social rights, they are leading to an erosion of people's economic and social rights, and then satisfying ourselves with the fact that there's a new cash transfer program that may be putting a little bit of money in a tiny fraction of the population's pockets.
Well, you said you don't want to focus on growth, and I understand, but in some ways this is a growth story, right? In part, what you're saying is, and Niranjan mentioned, relatively low growth rates. And one way you get out of a debt crisis to grow your way out of it, and it sounds like what you're saying, what you heard from those shopkeepers is, if you don't actually get money in the hands of the average person, you're not going to improve growth. You might actually hurt it. And so you're not going to grow your way out. Of course, redistribution, rebalancing, to use Niranjan's word, is also a really critical element here. But it seems like both things should be in the IMF's target. Niranjan, is the IMF kind of not seeing this from your perspective? Or is their view, look, it is so hard to get governments to do the right thing, to be austere, to cut spending. We see a crisis coming down the road. We can't focus on these small marginal issues, how they exactly design the algorithm on redistribution. We just need to push for austerity. Is that sort of the error that they're making? How do you consider this view?
That's a big question, and that's a very good question. And it depends on institutions' objective function, right? IMF looks at debt sustainability is its objective. So countries need to be fiscally sustainable. So if you start with that, what kind of mechanisms help achieving that? One of the mechanisms that helps achieving that is their debt sustainability analysis. What goes into debt sustainability analysis is they have mentioned threshold, okay, the countries with this kind of thresholds can be considered achieving their sustainability. Now, these mechanisms, we are trying to improve how these mechanisms can take into consideration different aspects than just the money. And one of the things is the countries like Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, I mean all these developing countries and also elsewhere, the parties, they have potential to grow, right? I mean, and how that potential can grow unless you provide injections of fiscal resources rather than taking it out, right? So if you invest, then only they will grow. But if you take it out, it is a leakage. So obviously it will reduce growth. And that's what's happening. I fully agree with Sarah that the programs that IMF is mentioning, is implementing, or Jordan or Egypt or countries are implementing, why they are not coming out of that is that those investments need to help growing the economy rather than you put something but you take out a lot of it. So the net effect is negative.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of Devex Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
I guess, Sarah, you mentioned the Arab Spring earlier. Did we learn any lessons from the Arab Spring? If the IMF says, look, we just have to do whatever it takes to achieve debt sustainability, that's our mandate, as Niranjan mentions. And if they push too hard, it sounds like what you're saying is, hey, we might be pushing these societies into a fractured state. Is that how you're looking at it? And are there lessons from the Arab Spring that we should be taking away?
It's hard to think about the Arab Spring and its lessons without, particularly at this moment, going to some pretty dark thoughts, right? I mean, clearly what the actual lessons should be if we are to get toward a region where people can live in dignity, is that the extent to which people lose hope because of the economic situation that they live in requires a completely new approach. And the reason that I bring up the growth thing is because I think that when many times when economists think about growth, they look at it as like the aggregate number. And Oxfam actually has an excellent report specifically on inequality in MENA that shows that the accumulation of wealth at the very top has doubled in recent years. And so that can show up as growth, right? But the question becomes, where is this growth coming from? And you can actually degrow the wealth at the very top if you're growing the wealth in the vast majority of the population is experiencing.
That's such an important point, especially if you think about long-term growth as the objective, because you could certainly have short-run growth that looks pretty good without looking under the hood at what's actually happening, and it turns out it's all going to the top.
Absolutely.
And then
Absolutely.
Is that wealth staying in the country? Is it being invested in the long-term growth of the country?
I mean, I think that the major insight that the IMF actually understands very well is that distribution matters for macro stability. It also matters, as we know from the Arab Spring, for political and social stability. And so I think that when we start, the reason that I propose that we use a human rights framework is not only because, or not primarily because, governments have actually signed on to these agreements and their legal obligations. It's because when we censor people and when we censor their rights, we actually get better economic outcomes, we get better social outcomes. And what does that mean in practice? That means instead of looking at big aggregate numbers, we're actually looking at questions of, instead of even looking at poverty, which is itself an arbitrary line, we're looking at multidimensional poverty. We're looking at, do people have good health care? Do they have good education? Do they have buffers against income insecurity? Do they have access to housing? I mean, these are the questions that economists, that the IMF should be asking. And we know that when we ensure that people have their rights realized, that's when we get much better economic outcomes, we get better social outcomes. And so the idea of just cutting spending and looking at this from some detached place in Washington at some numbers that we can kind of move things around and we'll cut here and we'll raise there and that's going to get us to a magic number, that does not work.
Right, so that simple math problem I mentioned at the beginning really isn't that simple. And Niranjan, to add another element to it, you brought up climate before. And Kristalina Georgieva has gotten a little bit into trouble for being an IMF leader who talks a lot about climate. We interviewed a member of the Republican House of Representatives who was critical of that focus. And there's people who say, look, the IMF should just do the math and forget about this sort of perspective. But if we are thinking about the long-term outcomes for countries and for their people, it's hard not to think about climate, especially in this region, one of the most water-stressed parts of the world. Where does climate fit into your thinking on this question of debt sustainability and social protection?
Absolutely. This is an important element. Most of the loans in the region that have been channeled to these sectors, because the region is very water scarce. I think 90% of the people in the region are living in water scarce. 15 out of 15 countries in the region are water scarce, defined as water scarce. So obviously, in Jordan also, for example, the water sector contributes to significantly large fiscal deficits. So you can imagine the impact on financing climate action. This there is a lot of plays on climate finance, international climate finance flows, but the region receives most of it in terms of debt, again, than in terms of grant. So
these countries are a little too rich, basically, right? I mean, they're not rich countries, but they're a little too rich from an income perspective to get a lot of grant aid. So then the challenge is, do you just give them more debt? But we're already here to talk about how their debt levels are too high.
But when it is climate, it's not just only there by investing in climate or by spending on climate action. They're not only improving their national priorities, achieving their national priorities, but they're also contributing to the global goals. So that's why we're talking about why the climate finance flows have an inherent bias to debt rather than it should be grant, which can support the global goal. And that's where we're thinking of what are the mechanisms, given these challenges, as I mentioned, that the domestic resources capacity is low, improving efficiency doesn't happen overnight, improving domestic resources doesn't happen overnight. Countries do need finance in terms of debt finance to finance their social spending for the day-to-day needs, for providing food subsidies, or in case of Tunisia, for example, essential energy subsidies. You must be, it's all over the news how Tunisia is protesting against the IMF program on this issue. But also, they need finance to spend on climate action. If the debt service is too high and taking a large chunk of the revenues, then obviously they will not have resources to spend on climate action. And that means they will keep on borrowing, and that adds to the debt rollover. That's what is happening. And then at SQA, we are thinking of what are the opportunities to enhance this fiscal space that the countries can spend on climate and connected to SDGs, so that that helps achieving their climate agenda, their nationally determined contributions, and that also be growth generating. So we are always looking at...
Right, there's an opportunity in this, right, in a way, because like Sarah, we're talking about countries that are oil importers, and so they're burning dirty fossil fuels for energy, and yet these are countries that are blessed with a lot of sun. You would think if there were a financing mechanism that could let you invest in the long run, future of the countries, the green transition, they should be big beneficiaries of it.
I think about this all the time. It is absolutely criminal that you do not have more solar energy across the Middle East. 40% of Lebanon's debt comes from electricity subsidies, right? The idea that these countries are spending so much on a fossil fuel economy, and the only question is how much they should transfer of that cost onto the publics who are people who are already struggling, is a complete lack of imagination. And I think that the massive subsidy reform that and is still sweeping the region, and the fact that it is delinked from an energy transition strategy, is an inexplicable missed opportunity. I look at IMF programs and I cannot understand why. Sometimes you'll get some, language around the importance of removing subsidies from a climate perspective, but it's just a way of wrapping this very painful measure in some language that sounds good, because you don't actually see it linked to investments in renewable energy.
So it's mostly just like one side of the equation. Like, we'll cut the subsidies for oil and gas, which of course hurts poor and middle class people who can hardly afford it. But we're not make the investments on the other side of the equation to reduce the cost of energy by investing, let's say, in solar. And when you think about Niranjan's earlier point about the unemployment, particularly youth unemployment in the region, the energy transition should also create an opportunity for new jobs.
Actually, interestingly, in Jordan, there was an effort there was a program when they removed the fuel subsidies to have solar panels on low-income houses of people with low incomes. And for some reason, it still exists, but it just hasn't really been very successful. But you take that as an example. Like, why is that not incorporated into the IMF program? Why is that not getting funding in order to dramatically increase Jordan's solar capacity? I mean, there are other issues in Jordan around the contract that it signed for gas with Israel that prevents it from, that kind of locks it into purchasing a certain amount of gas. But, even that, right? Like, if instead of just saying, let's transfer the cost of this onto people, and governments were taking seriously actually reducing the long-term costs of relying on fossil fuels, we would be seeing much better economic outcomes, but also, helping to mitigate climate change, which is impacting the region which is, as you mentioned, a region that deals with a lot of water scarcity and heat and extreme heat and other impacts from climate change.
Niranjan, you've got a debt swap initiative at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia that ESQA, as we've mentioned. What is that exactly? And is it a solution here? Is it something that you want people here at the IMF and World Bank annual meetings to pay more attention to?
Thanks, Raj. But before I answer the question, I just want to put a caveat that yes, just energy transition is important for the region, but that's not the important priority. It's every country has defined their nationally determined contributions, and they are moving forward. There are also significant challenges in putting solar panels. It's also an importing cost for many countries, but they are moving forward. There are technical challenges. Sarah, I would beg to differ that it's not that as simple.
Can you give a quick example there, just so we understand? Like, where is there it's not as simple as we think. Where is there a challenge?
It's because the technology itself is importing for them again. So it requires hard currency to buy the solar panels. Mm-hmm. This is one challenge. Second, the region has climate issues which are specific, the sandstorms and the space and the capacity of the solar panels, the efficiency of it to take into account most of the region. For example, when you use the air conditions, how efficient are the solar panels for that, for water heating? So these challenges still are not yet adequately addressed by the efficiency of the solar panels. On this issue of addressing the climate challenges and how the countries can move forward in renewables, and more so how they can do more adaptation activities. So this is one of the focus of the region is adaptation. Water scarcity being the high concern of the countries. We started to see, as I was saying, how to enhance the fiscal space of the countries so that they not only be able to invest or not only be able to spend on social spending of essential services, but also look at focusing spending on climate-related actions, including adaptation and mitigation activities. In that context, we developed the debt swap donor nexus initiative.
Just explain what is a debt swap. How does it actually work?
The way we are debt swaps of various nature. There are commercial debt swaps which involves all creditors, multilateral, bilateral, as well as private creditors. The bilateral debt swap that we are focuses on the Paris Club creditors and the debtors in the country who have a common objective of achieving SDGs, or they have a commitment to achieve the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and also the climate Paris Agreement, basically. So in that context, the bilateral creditors, the debtors are committed to pay back the external debt, and those debt services, instead of paying back in hard currency, which is a constraint for the debtor, if that can be converted to local investments, so the same amount of money or a part of it as agreed between the bilateral creditor and the debtor, if that can be channeled to investments in the country, so that means the country can invest in local currency in climate-related activities.
So the rich country that's owed the money can say, look, instead of paying me, put the money in your local currency into climate-relevant investments, because that achieves a goal the rich country has too, which is to lower carbon emissions, slow the speed of climate change.
Yes, that's the crux of it. The challenge is which are the programs that the debtor country need to invest in. That's where we support how to design the program which achieve the national priority, and that can have buy-in from the creditor as well. So there should be a common agreement on the program itself and how it is monitoring, the selection, monitoring, and evaluation of the program.
Right, because the creditor countries have to sell this to their own population to say, look, we're in a way spending money here by not taking the payments in hard currency. These programs we're instead investing in are really effective. These are climate mitigation and adaptation programs that the world will benefit from. I think just as we wrap up here, Sarah, what would you want to see the IMF do differently, understand differently as they come to the tables like the ones we're sitting around right now, and present to MENA countries their plan? What would you want to see them kind of do or think differently in this moment in 2023 than they have in the many recent pasts when they've done similar sorts of plans and deals?
Look, we're at the annual meetings, and in my experience of these past few days, there is very serious disconnect between the discussions that, for example, we're having right now, or that civil society groups are having, representing what people's concerns are, and the conversations at the official IMF and World Bank meetings. So I think that as a first step, we need to bridge that divide. I think that the idea presented is an extremely interesting one.
The debt swap idea.
The debt swap idea. But I think it requires a sense that we need to think with fresh eyes about how to proceed. And a very key piece of this that the IMF can do is to bring the public into these negotiations in a way that it is currently not doing. Who are they negotiating with? They're negotiating behind closed doors with finance ministries. And so very often elite interests are those that are protected. But if they were actually publishing proposed policies and the impact on people while the loans are being negotiated, and the public can actually see what the various options on the table are and how they would be affected by it, they actually bring the public in as a stakeholder to these negotiations and enable public pressure to get better policy outcomes.
That's a really interesting idea, because if you think about the situation the IMF finds itself in, for years it's been told, don't flex your muscle as some big global Western power in these countries. Countries get to decide. And you shouldn't bring all these conditions along the way. And so they're in the somewhat sensitive position of not wanting to use their leverage in any undue way and kind of interrupt the domestic political process. On the other hand, if they could be transparent, in a way, it doesn't interrupt, it doesn't add conditions, it just simply puts a little sunlight on what they're talking about. So
I think the problem has been a false dichotomy between the IMF deciding or governments or finance ministries deciding. And what I'm proposing is a third option, which is public ownership of the outcomes. And in order to do that, they need to have informed, meaningful engagement with the public that is assuming the loan and impacted by the loan, so that which would have better outcomes for programs themselves. We're seeing in Pakistan, for example, huge protests because of electricity price hikes related to the IMF program there. And the managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, tweeted to the people of Pakistan, ask your government to collect more money from the wealthy. Well, now she's saying that in a tweet. But what if, during the negotiation of the program, there was a clear choice presented to the public, to the people of Pakistan, that these are the options that your government needs to make a decision on? How would that have changed the political calculus and maybe gotten to a different outcome during the loan negotiations, rather than after everything is already triggering public protests?
Yeah, it's a very tricky calculation for the IMF, because to what degree do they want to be out there kind of in the domestic political environment in Pakistan? On the other hand, if they don't address it up front, you may end up with what you're seeing there, and it's playing out in many other parts of the world. Now, just as we wrap up and thinking about what the IMF, kind of the mindset shift you want them to have, you put some pretty big ideas on the table. You said, look, think about growth and investment mindset, not just austerity. You talked about rebalancing as an approach. You've talked about the idea of finding creative ways to change the picture, including debt swaps, and to think long-term about climate as both a threat but also an opportunity. So
as a growth driver also.
As a growth driver, right? The green transition, you can use it to generate jobs. I mean, my guess is none of this is all new terrain to the IMF. What do you think is the mindset shift they need to have?
Absolutely. I think that's the key word, perhaps, mindset change. And I fully agree with what Sarah was saying, public disclosure of these negotiations, not only at the national level, but also at the debt resolution discussions level also. I mean, these mindset changes are important. And I think IMF is at the helm of several mechanisms where it can help providing credible solutions. So disclosure is one thing, it's important, but going one step forward is what are the credible solutions that international community, IMF or Bretton Woods institutions, I would say, can provide. One of the things is IMF, the debt resolution, as we have seen from the international financing architecture, it's not delivering, not efficient, significantly impacting countries. Those who are already impacted, the protracted discussions is impacting them further. So how that process can be more efficient, how it can give a voice to the debtors. For example, debtors do not have they are slowly improving, but it has not yet reached that. So the Sustainable Debt Coalition, where UNECA and UNESCO, as well as Egypt Ministry of Finance, advocated for this coming together, developing countries, how they can get a voice in these debt resolutions, how it can help them enhancing their fiscal space while addressing debt. It's one way IMF can take into account their voices of concerns and not just fiscal sustainability, but also social sustainability and economic sustainability to take into account. This is one thing. Two, you mentioned about beginning that they are definitely the multilaterals are not giving a low rate of interest. Their cost of borrowing, rate of lending is high. So how can they improve their concessional lending? In 2010, for example, the concessional part of the loan was about 70% from the multilaterals, from their own lending loan portfolio. Today, it's about 45%. So if that is the space, then where the multilaterals are going is to the market, and the market is very high rate of interest. So obviously, how to reduce the rate of lending from the multilaterals, how to improve the part of concessional lending is another change required. And the most important is also, in this context, structural adjustment of the tools of debt sustainability analysis. For example, in the debt sustainability, the debt swap is not a tool at all discussed about it. Instead of stabilizing debt in a package which can stabilize the economy, instead of that, we talk about how can Mauritania, for example, reduce the debt to GDP from 45% to 35%. Is that essential? Or can we make the...
Right, that's another critical point you made in this conversation, is just as part of that mindset shift, what is the goal? And a lot of it depends on the time frame we're thinking about here. And if you're looking at this like a doctor trying to save a patient on the table right now, you might do certain things, but we have the benefit of history. We can look back on how things have developed, and you can see the connection between how average people, how their lives are shaped by decisions made at places like the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF here in Marrakech, and what it ultimately means for the direction of their country, their long-term growth, and then ultimately the ability to manage these debts. So it really is all connected. And I know this has been a very technical conversation in some ways, but in a lot of ways it translates right down to the lives of average people. And so I just want to thank my colleagues here for taking some time to have this discussion with us today. Sarah Saadoun, the Senior Researcher for Economic Justice and Human Rights at Human Rights Watch. Thanks so much, Sarah. Niranjan Sarangi, Senior Economic Affairs Officer in the Shared Economic Prosperity Cluster at UNESCO. We heard of what UNESCO is. It's just been a great discussion. I want to thank the Open Society Foundation for sponsoring this special edition of This Week in Global Development. I want to thank our producer, Naomi Mihara, and our project manager, Blanca Cierco, and everybody who's been listening to this podcast and contributing to the conversation we have every day on Devex and on all the social media platforms we're on. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a Devex Pro member by going to devex.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.